Welcome back to Coronation Windsor, a weekly mini-series where we look into the history of the British monarchy and coronations. Queen Regents and Queen Consorts. On the 6th of May 2022, Camilla, the wife of King Charles III, will be crowned Queen Consort by her husband's side. Camilla will be the first Queen Consort in 86 years to be crowned in Westminster Abbey. The last Queen Consort who was crowned in Westminster Abbey was Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, in May 1937. The last Queen Regent was, of course, Queen Elizabeth II. With each king or queen regent having one coronation ceremony in their lifetime, they and queen consorts have their shares of triumphs, embarrassments and humiliations. And while we do not have time to cover all of them, historians reading about each coronation story have been known to be thrilled and surprised about each one. So in this video, from pregnancies, joint coronations, a comedic performance, to slamming doors, here are 8 coronation stories about Queen Regents and Queen Consorts. Matilda of Flanders. The wife of the infamous William the Conqueror, Matilda became the first queen in British history to have a separate coronation ceremony and to be given the title Regina. Matilda wasn't meant to be Queen of England, but because of her relation to Alfred the Great, there could have been a chance that her relatives might have been monarchs of England and France, since she was a granddaughter to a French king. When Matilda married William around 1031, Matilda was a woman who was dedicated to her religion, and she was a woman of steel. In 1066, a succession crisis had occurred when St. Edward the Confessor had died. Harold Godwinson was crowned king, but because Edward promised Harold and William the throne, William felt that the English crown was rightfully his. In the autumn, William left Normandy with an army to take control over England. Prior to his leave, William made Matilda regent. She worked hard to protect the Duchy of Normandy. However, she had concerns and fears for her husband's safety and prayed for him constantly. When she received word about his victory at the Battle of Hastings, Matilda was relieved. Matilda didn't travel to England until the spring of 1068, and Matilda became pregnant not long after. Matilda was crowned in a splendid and magnificent ceremony at Westminster Abbey. She was crowned at Whitsuntide by the Archbishop of Canterbury, and during the procession she had 4 male apostles instead of female martyrs, which was traditional for the processions for queen consorts. Following her coronation, she gave birth to a baby boy who would become the future Henry I. Matilda became a popular queen in England, and when she died in 1083, she was mourned there and in Normandy. Anne Boleyn. From one pregnant queen consort to another, the coronation of Henry VIII's second wife has been remembered as the most lavish ceremony for a queen consort in the Tudor period. While Henry's joint coronation with his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was grand, Henry spared no expense for Anne, and it was because of their unborn child. The couple didn't want their baby to be born a bastard, so Henry threw himself in to marry Anne and crown her queen to legitimise him. By him, this meant the future Prince of Wales. This wasn't an easy task, as by marrying Anne, Henry had made himself a bigamist. But he didn't care what anyone thought of his actions. After the country's break with Rome, Henry and his government had passed a law called the Act of Succession. In the law, published in April 1533, it states that it named Anne regent should anything happen to the king before their children reach mature age. It also says that any children they would have be legitimate and eligible for the throne. Days before Anne's coronation, a court at Dunstable, led by Thomas Cranmer, agreed to make her marriage to Henry valid. On the 1st of June, Anne was crowned Queen in Westminster Abbey by Cranmer, who was also the Archbishop of Canterbury. During the ceremony, and in a political move by Henry's request, Cranmer crowned Anne with St. Edward's crown. This was so the king could show his courtiers that Anne and their heir were the rightful queen and prince of the realm. Following the service, a mass was held with Anne receiving the sacrament and made offerings at the shrine of St. Edward. 3 months later, Anne and Henry's child was born. However, the baby turned out to be a girl who was named Elizabeth. 3 years later, Anne was executed under the false charges of pre-regicide, witchcraft, and incest. Queen Elizabeth I. 25 years after her mother's controversial coronation, Elizabeth made her own political moves by including Catholics in her ceremony before she converted England back to being a Protestant country. Elizabeth grew up where politics and religion had a strained division. Her father broke away from Rome to marry Anne Boleyn, and this caused a family rift in later years between her and her half-sister, Mary I. At one point, Elizabeth was imprisoned in the Tower of London, where Mary suspected that Elizabeth was part in a plot to overthrow her. Mary had tried to conceive a child to carry on the Catholic faith in England, but she had failed. When Mary I died in 1558, Elizabeth had been prepared by making her own plans for her government 1 month before. Despite being Protestant, Elizabeth had kept Catholic symbols, including the crucifix. On the 15th of January 1559, Elizabeth was crowned at Westminster Abbey, making her the second Queen Regina in British history. During her coronation, Elizabeth allowed the Bishop of Carlisle, a Catholic, to lead the ceremony and crown her queen. During the coronation, the bishop led the ceremony in Latin. However, parts of the service, after Elizabeth had the crown upon her head, were read twice. First in Latin and then in English. This was a bold move, as following the coronation, Elizabeth and her government implanted the Elizabethan religious settlement soon after. The settlement laid the foundations of the Church of England, becoming the main and independent religion of England. Henrietta Maria. The only Queen Consort on our list, Henrietta Maria was the wife to the executed Charles I. She was a hated figure in England because of her Catholic religion and loyalty to the Pope. She was even cruelly nicknamed the Popish Brat of France. Henrietta Maria never wanted to give up her faith, and despite the numerous amount of times she was forced to convert to Protestantism, she stood her ground. On the 2nd of February 1626, Charles I and Henrietta Maria's coronation ceremonies took place, except, out of the pair, Henrietta was never crowned Queen Consort. On the day of the coronation, Henrietta Maria watched the procession entering the abbey from a private house. Because of the penal laws against Catholics, Henrietta Maria's religion prevented her from the coronation and entering the abbey. This greatly disappointed Charles, as he was hoping for a joint coronation. Following Charles's death, she would spend most of her last years in France. She would die from an opium overdose in 1669. Caroline of Brunswick. Caroline of Brunswick was a tragic consort who was unloved by her husband but loved by the English people. George IV thought she was unattractive, but he wasn't a pretty picture himself. The pair spent most of their marriage separated, and they were unfaithful to each other. In January 1820, Caroline became queen following the death of King George III. Caroline was living in Naples when she heard the news of her father-in-law and travelled back to England to be crowned queen. The government offered Caroline £50,000 to stay out of the country, but she declined. She returned to Britain and settled in the city of London. She stayed there for 15 months. On the day of her estranged husband's coronation, the 29th of April 1821, Caroline asked the Prime Minister, Robert Jenkinson, what to wear for the ceremony. When he told her she would not be taking part, Caroline arrived at the door to the Abbey. As she walked towards it, she shouted to the pages, "The Queen! Open! I am the Queen of England!" But the door was slammed in her face when the pages were instructed to close it under George's orders. Caroline was insulted, and after returning to her house in Hammersmith, she wrote to George asking for her own coronation ceremony in the following month. She died 19 days later. Queen Victoria. In June 1837, a month after her 18th birthday, Victoria was proclaimed queen following the passing of her uncle William IV. When she had her own coronation at Westminster Abbey in 1838, Victoria's coronation became somewhat of a comedic act, as there were a lot of errors that occurred during the 5-hour-long ceremony. Before the occasion, there wasn't a rehearsal because no one knew what was happening and what they should do, all except Victoria and the Sub-Dean of Westminster. During the service, the coronation ring, or the wedding ring of England, was painfully forced onto the wrong finger, when it should have been on the ring finger. Then, while making his homage to Queen Victoria, Lord John Roll fell down the steps near the coronation chair. In her diary, Victoria recalls the event. Poor old Lord Rolls, who is 82 and dreadfully infirm, fell in attempting to descend the steps, rolled right down, but was not the least hurt. When he attempted again to ascend the steps, I advanced to the edge in order to prevent another fall. The final thing that went wrong was when Victoria had to rush back to her seat when a confused bishop told her the ceremony was over. After all of this, you would think a teenager like Victoria would be embarrassed, but her response about the event was quite the opposite. The enthusiasm, she wrote in her diary, the affection and loyalty were really touching, and I shall remember this day as the proudest of my life. Talk about a day to remember. Queen Alexandra of Denmark. I know this is cheating here, but she had to be included on the list because she was witness to 2 disruptions that happened during her coronation ceremony. Prior to their joint coronation ceremony, Edward VII had been recovering from an operation. Because of this, Edward was crowned with the imperial state crown instead of St. Edward's crown. Alexandra was crowned by the Bishop of York. She had a crown built especially for her, which contained the Koh-i-Noor diamond. So, what were the disruptions? The first disruption came involving the Archbishop of Canterbury, but you can't blame him for this first disruption. Due to his poor eyesight and that he had to be supported throughout the service by 2 bishops, the Archbishop needed assistance with reading the text of service. When the Archbishop struggled to rise after kneeling to pay his homage to Edward, the King and bishops helped him back up onto his feet. The Archbishop then put the crown on back to front on Edward's head before shouting, "Go away," when a colleague inquired about the Archbishop's health. Another disruption occurred when Edward's youngest sister, Princess Beatrice, accidentally dropped her service book onto a gold plate table. But, despite them, it's fair to say that the pair's coronation was one to remember. Queen Elizabeth II. Now, we can't conclude this video without mentioning the late Queen Elizabeth II. Honestly, it would be a crime if she was left out. 69 years ago, Elizabeth made a historical landmark when she became the first British monarch to have her coronation recorded live on television. Before then, coronations would have been recorded live on radio, but Prince Philip suggested to have the service televised as a way to modernise the monarchy. However, no Member of Parliament or the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, wanted the service to be televised. He even explained that having a televised coronation would be an affront to its dignity and religious character. Elizabeth was annoyed by this and she requested to have the coronation shown on television. She succeeded, and on the 2nd of June 1953, over 27 million people watched the ceremony in Britain, and nothing went wrong, except for the typical British weather. It was raining, but it didn't stop people coming outside the Mall and Westminster Abbey to see the new Queen on her special day. But the nothing went wrong part was a lie. As well as the rain, there was an incident involving the carpet which had been laid with a pile running the wrong way. This meant that the coronation robes Elizabeth wore had trouble gliding over the carpet pile, and the metal fringe on her golden mantle caught in the pile of the carpet. While trying to move forward, Elizabeth clawed her back. In the middle of it all, Elizabeth told the Archbishop of Canterbury to get her started. Apart from those incidents, everything ran like clockwork. What do you think will happen on Camilla's big day? Guess we'll just have to wait and see. Who's your favourite Queen Regent or Consort? Share your thoughts in the comments. Tune in tomorrow for a new video. If you enjoyed the mini-series, please like and subscribe. Thank you so much for your support, and until then, God save the King.